Claire, and I would like to welcome you for our this afternoon, early evenings event. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce our event with Clare McCool and Rachael Wiseman presenting their new book, Metaphysical Animals, How Four Women Brought Philosophy Back to Life. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and just the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our events calendar is in full swing with plenty of both in-person and virtual events. And you can see our calendar on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order Metaphysical Animals. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event is going to include time for your questions. So if you have a question for authors at any time during the event, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual events over the past 2.5 years, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Clare McCool is a professor at Durham University and an expert in the philosophy of perception and aesthetics. Her work focuses on the perception of space and spatial properties, including both the perception of empty space and the nature of our experience in ways that make it immune to skeptical redescription. Rachael Wiseman is a philosophy lecturer at the University of Liverpool with a specialty in the intersection of philosophy of mind, action, and ethics. And she was awarded a British Academy Rising Star Engagement Award for work with a local arts organization. Together, in addition to writing this book, which we're going to hear about tonight, they are the co-directors of Women in Parenthesis, which is a scholarly project that makes the case for analytic philosophy's first all-female philosophical school. Philosophy has been dominated by the ideas of so-called great men from Plato and Aristotle through the Enlightenment, and histories of European philosophy are frankly full of dudes. But dig a little deeper and a different picture begins to emerge. In their new group biography, Metaphysical Animals, McCool and Wiseman reveal the story of four women at Oxford: Elizabeth Anscombe, Mary Midgley, Iris Murdoch, and Philippa Foot, who developed a new branch of philosophy that was uniquely suited to the 20th century and the upheaval and destruction of world war. Together, they created a way of ethical thinking that is there for us today. In a review in the Daily Mail, Catherine Hughes writes, "This terrific book follows the charismatic quartet as they plot to overturn the moral relativism of male colleagues who argue that there is no such thing as good or bad, merely self-interest. The result is a group biography that is both gossipy and gripping, but also, like the women themselves, profoundly serious. It's a triumph." And The Guardian says, its story underwrites its argument that philosophical insight is not conveyed primarily by words on a page, but through a life well lived. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. As soon as I can bring you up on screen, the podium will be yours. Here we go. It's all yours.
Are we on?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming. I'm Rachael.
And I'm Clare. And we're here in Northumberland in the northeast corner of England. And you'll see it's pretty dark outside because it's about 10 o'clock here. But it's really lovely to be here and, to think of you guys listening in Harvard. Yeah, it's a lovely thing to contemplate.
So we thought we'd start by telling you a little bit about our book, which is Metaphysical Animals, which is just out in the US this week. So as Claire just said in her gorgeous introduction there, it's a group biography of four women, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and Mary Midgley. These women were all born just after the First World War, and they all went up to Oxford University just at the outbreak of the Second World War. And the book kind of follows their story from when they first meet as 19-year-olds on the cusp of the Second World War through to the mid-1950s, and kind of follows them through their philosophical education and their adventures together as friends and against the kind of the background of world history, but also these amazing philosophical events that were happening at the same time. So we'll talk more, I guess, about the drama of the book in our conversation, but we thought we could maybe start off, I don't know if you want to do this, telling you a little bit about the genesis of the book and how it came about.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel and I are co-authors and we're friends. So, I mean, the book is very much sort of an expression of our friendship. I would say we actually wrote together pretty much on this sofa during lockdown with lots of biscuits and tea to kind of fuel us. But we first met in 2013 and we were just starting out our careers in philosophy, and we were daunted, but also feeling a little bit kind of not weird, not quite the right word, and we were trying to think, how could we make our way in this discipline? It's the internet is a little bit unstable, Claire, I don't know if it's okay. But academic philosophy has a tendency, has had a tendency to be quite narrow in its focus, quite narrow in its kind of methods. And we felt, both of us, I think, thought that, you know, we want to do philosophy in a more creative way, a more open way. Traditionally as well, philosophy can be quite combative, and I particularly didn't enjoy that kind of style of doing philosophy. And we thought there must be a way of doing philosophy together as friends. So that was the kind of the background. We just met and we had this kind of difficulty with philosophy, and we were trying to find our way in philosophy. And then we came across an article in The Guardian, which was written by an Oxford professor called Joe Wolfe. Anyway, so Joe pointed out the fact that these four women were at Oxford at the same time during World War II. And it turned out that those four women they became like major figures in 20th century analytic philosophy. And he said, well, look, these four women were at Oxford together during World War II. Is that significant? Like, you know, how is it that these women tended to, you know, they flourished in philosophy, where other people didn't? Anyway, so he just posed this question: how come these four emerged as major voices in the last century? And Mary Midgley, who was the only one of the four to be still alive, that's her there, she wrote back into The Guardian, the newspaper that he was writing in, and she said, look, the reason why us four managed to get through in philosophy, the reason we flourished, was basically because the men were away and our talents got the attention that they deserved. Because basically when the men left, women were not quite in the majority, but for the first time kind of ever in the history of third level education, they were, you know, there was just more women about, like they were kind of critical majority, if you like. And we both came across this. Well, Rachel, you were more struck by it and you sort of pointed it out to me, but we just, when we reflected on it, we thought, my goodness, is there something in this? Is there something about just the demographics, you know, the fact that we're such a minority, that is somehow shaping all these norms and could potentially, you know, explain some of the difficulties that we had with philosophy. So we thought, well, we need to find out a bit more about this. And Mary was still alive, and she lived actually just in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is just down the road from where we are. So we thought, well, we've got to go and talk to this woman. And she was 96 at the time, I think. So we went there with a film crew.
She was living in like a Quaker retirement home.
Yeah,
she?
In a tiny little room.
Yeah.
But she was just brilliant, as sparky as ever.
Yeah.
And she's actually writing this book,
What
is Philosophy For? Which she finished when she was 99. It published just before she died. But yeah, she was the tonic that we were looking for. You know, she became our sort of guru, and she told us the story about her and her friends. So it turned out that it's not just that these women were contemporaries together at Oxford, they were actually friends. You know, it's not just that they happened to be there, they were talking to each other, they're doing philosophy together. And she just told us their story, basically. And in telling us her, their story, she kind of imparted to us a kind of different picture of what philosophy is, you know, how it can be practiced.
Yeah.
So, and we poured all of that kind of inspiration, if you like, into Metaphysical Animals.
Yeah.
But this, I mean, there's so much to say now.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue?
Well, so maybe we should say something like just picking up what you said about the sort of inspiration of Mary, a little bit about how that then reflected how we went about writing the book.
Yeah.
So we wanted the book to be not just a kind of standard biography of, you know, oh, here's what happened, here were these people, they did these things, here were their thoughts, but we really wanted it to be like a different picture of what a philosophical life looked like and what philosophy was. And the title in Metaphysical Animals is meant to capture this sort of vision of the human that is contained within the book and which is contained within these four women's lives. And the subtitle, which is How Four Women Brought Philosophy Back to Life, reflects a number of ways in which life kind of figures in their thought and in the book. So we wanted to make it the case that you could see in the book and in the biography the way in which the philosophy was emerging out of their life and out of the experiences that they were having at the time. So what we tried to do in the book was tell this story of these 20 years of their lives together when they as individuals are growing up. You know, they're going from 19-year-old women professors. And we wanted to carry you through the story of their development and their growing as a group and as individuals. We wanted to situate that life pattern against the background of, you know, the Second World War and everything that came with that, and the refugees and the, you know, this sense of being in the beginning of, you know, of world history happening around you, and women's rights and all that sort of stuff. And then what we wanted to do was to tell the story in a way so that running through threaded through the story is a philosophical argument, so that you as a reader, even if you don't know any philosophy, we wrote it for people who didn't know any philosophy and for people who do know philosophy, even if you didn't know any philosophy, you could kind of join the book at the beginning as these women did, as, you know, turning up at the first lecture and hearing the philosophy. And as you go through the book, you pick up the philosophical education that they had. So you meet Sartre, you meet Wittgenstein, you go to some lectures on Aristotle, you learn, you know, you go to another lecture on Hume, you meet you have a seminar on Kant from a famous refugee scholar. So you go with them through this education, and then you work with them through their lives as they then start to put this philosophy that they're piecing together into action to try to make sense of what's going on. So we say in the preface that you can read the book in two ways. You know, you can read it as a kind of group biography and a history of a particular moment in women's education and in European history, or you can read it as a philosophical argument, or hopefully you can read it as both. I think is the
ideally both. And I mean, that connects again back to the question of the title, Metaphysical Animals. So like the kind of basic idea is that we are animals. Like Mary Midgley says, you know, we're not just like animals, we are animals. But the particular kind of animal that we are is we are creative animals. We are animals that question. We're animals that philosophize, that create, but that ask why. And I suppose the idea of philosophy kind of emerging from life is, you know, we surrounded our women who are kind of characters in the book with these world events that are and they're asking why and how. And like, you know, when Philippa Foot learns about the Holocaust, you know, she says, look, you can't imagine how shattering it was to learn these facts. We didn't think this was possible. And then, you know, she makes her life's work to try and understand, like in a way, like she's just sort of in the face of these events. She's just asking sort of why, how, and and what is it to live a good human life, and
and how do we go on as individuals and collectively in the face of this new reality?
In the face of this new reality. For Elizabeth Anscombe, it was in addition Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because we are these creative animals, we can create kind of forms of reality and kind of patterns of behavior that are kind of unspeakable, that are kind of inimical even to human survival. So there, she's running up against the kind of limits of what it is to be a human, and then kind of asking how, why. So I guess, the idea of philosophy, so bringing philosophy back to life, and the idea of metaphysical animals, those things kind of come together, because the metaphysical animal is always constantly asking why and trying to make sense of reality. But we only ever have these kind of very limited, we only ever have a limited perspective on reality, but then reality is sort of pushing all these questions, making us ask all of these questions. So yes, we wanted this sort of idea of,
I think the other thing, just to like build on what you were saying there about, because these women see the philosophy as, well, you always use this lovely phrase of practical perplexity. Like the philosophy comes out of just the everyday life that we live, thinking, should I tell my friend that her husband is having an affair? Should I, should I have children? Should I take this job or this job? Like these just confrontations with other people and with life kind of raise these questions that are philosophical, because often they're questions about what's important and what matters. They're not, practical ones that you can look and answer up in a book. They're a question about what matters to you and what matters to us. So in that sense, they're philosophical. But for all these women, they have a vision of what philosophy is. They have a vision of philosophy as a human need, and as something that is, in that sense, very kind of down to earth, isn't it? It's not some kind of technical, clever game that you can only play if you've, studied for 10 years at a boys' public school or whatever, that requires some great technical wizardry, and that can be left to this, elite group of people to sort of do in their studies and write impenetrable books about. Rather, philosophy is something that is a human need that we are all doing all the time. Whenever we ask this question, what matters, what's important, and that as they saw it, what was needed was a kind of framework, a philosophical framework to help people think through those questions in their day-to-day lives.
And I think another aspect of that kind of again comes through in their philosophy and in our practice and the way we approach metaphysical animals is the fact that each lone individual kind of can't construct a kind of coherent picture of reality. We need to talk to each other, and friendship is a really good basis and maybe even a necessary basis for doing philosophy. And I think so one thing we tried to do is like just paint a really sort of vivid picture, I think, of the significance of their intellectual friendships, and the significance of friendship to understanding, I suppose, as well. And of course, like I couldn't have written this book without you, Rachel.
Well, no, we couldn't have done it without you.
Which I think is actually, it is, I mean, co-authorship in philosophy is quite unusual still. And just in terms of writing the book itself, I do think it's one of the more interesting aspects of the book that we've produced, because I think, I mean, I do love our book, to be honest, but I do think it has a kind of dimensionality, it has a kind of depth to it, or a sort of shape to it, because it was written by two people.
I think as well, because we wrote this book during the pandemic. So, we literally, the week before lockdown started, we were in Oxford university archives, and we were sort of taking photographs of all this amazing archival material, letters by the women, reports, tutorial reports from when they were undergraduates, photos. We were in the archive getting everything we could, and we got the sort of last train out of Oxford back, and then everything locked down. And so we had this amazing experience of the two of us sort of locked down with these 4 women and recreating this world, which was obviously, because it was the war for them, was full of disruption and changes in patterns and uncertainty about the future. And we were writing that together in this sort of intense situation. And it was really, it made them so vivid because we weren't seeing other people. It was just us and them, wasn't it?
It was, and we got to know them kind of, I feel. I mean, it's a funny thing getting to know a historical figure through archival material, but they do kind of come alive. Some Philippa Foot, I used to always say, was she burned quite a lot of her letters, and so was a little bit harder for us to kind of reconstruct. And I always sort of felt she was somehow sort of physically getting in the way, kind of obstructing us a little bit by having burnt these sort of letters. But then after a while, somehow she sort of gave we somehow got a kind of grip on her. But I think another thing about writing, I was just thinking during the pandemic, I don't know if this happened in the US, but in the UK at the beginning, at least for the first few months, there was a lot of, like, for example, in our local community, people almost, there was some aspect of the pandemic that they welcomed, because all of a sudden they had to kind of turn to their neighbors and kind of rely on their neighbors. And, typically we live quite isolated, busy lives, and people don't have the time, or they don't have the inclination, or they don't have the need. And I think that changed a little bit. And there was a lot of sort of discussion around that. And it was funny, kind of, I thought, kind of writing about the women's philosophy in this context, because it's really about our interdependency, on each other. We are completely interdependent. So there's a particular term for this. Aristotelian necessities. There's the kind of there's a way in which we are bound to get. There's a certain kind of, if you like, force in the world, which isn't like just cause and effect. It's a kind of, it's something that binds humans together. Aristotelian necessities. Anyway, so I think we were writing in a period when that was just incredibly salient, our human need for other individuals. And this is really at the heart of their philosophy, our interconnectedness. So for me, that was a really sort of poignant, striking, kind of needful aspect of the thing, just to really kind of get this out in a kind of theoretical way and kind of show it and make it salient and make it available. And Mary Midgley in particular, she is very, very critical of a kind of the individualistic kind of picture that kind of dominates Western philosophy. That's right. And she sees it quite gendered as well. She would see it as quite gendered. Do you want to say something?
Well, no, I'm just thinking about another aspect that was kind of exciting. You were talking there about the way in which Philippa Foot kind of emerged off the page for us at some point. But the other thing that was really stunning, and it connects with something that Clare said in the introduction, is that I think, we've got these kind of standard stories that we know about what happened and who did what, and they're sort of almost entirely populated by men, especially if they're stories about academia. But what we found was that once we made these 4 women kind of center of gravity of the story, that's really nice. Suddenly all the male figures that we all knew about, like Wittgenstein and Sartre and Austin and Aaron, sort of receded, and the people who sort of stepped forward, who were part of this, who surrounded these women, were of course the other women scholars in the women's colleges, refugees, because when the war started and the men, the young men and the male teachers left to do war work, a lot of refugee scholars from Europe kind of stepped in and took over some of the teaching. There were kind of conscientious objectors were suddenly
Yeah.
that we didn't know. And so suddenly we had this whole kind of cast of characters.
Like it's a network.
That you couldn't see until we kind of switched to make these women the focus. And I think one of the things that we kind of realized fairly early on in the writing process was that we're also used, when you introduce a character in a story, and we're so used to saying, and her father did this, that, and the other, or we introduce a male academic, and you never hear a word about his family or who was married or anything. Whereas if you introduce a female character, you quickly find out that she has so many children and this was the name of her husband. So we had to sort of quite quickly sort of strategize together, didn't we, as to how we were going to undo that kind of
tropes, these just standard tropes, narrative tropes, presentational tropes.
Yeah, so we did a number of things. Like we always introduced, like when we found out about people's mothers rather than their fathers. So we suddenly discovered all these amazing women who weren't amazing in the sense that our four were amazing, in that they've left this legacy of work, and there'll be household names, but just amazing because they were the first generation of women to vote, maybe, and they just did all sorts of things that were really pushing at the limits of what women could possibly expect to do, and within the confines that they were working in. We found all these refugee scholars who were bringing this amazing.
That was astonishing discovery for us. Because people have said that maybe it's kind of difficult to believe, but like Oxford was kind of a backwater, academically speaking, relative to the kind of great academic centers of like Milan, Berlin, Hamburg, I'm trying to think where else, Prague. And with Nazi legislation in 1933, Jewish academics were banned basically from employment in German universities, and so you had this massive influx onto the pavements of Oxford. And so by the time our women arrived, it was the sort of the intellectual giants of Europe kind of all suddenly converged in Oxford, and this is who they were being taught by. So one of the things that Mary had kind of told us and kind of insisted that we try and understand is, the climate changed when the young men went away to war. So suddenly, Mary says, like, their talents got the attention they deserved. People were listening to them when they spoke in seminars and so on. But what was, the real significance of the fact the men, so the real significance of the men being away was that they were taught by these incredible scholars and by women and conscientious objectors. So that was a huge revelation to us. We actually, although we knew what we were doing before we started writing the book, until we started, as you said, until we made those men sort of, until we sort of put them into the background, we couldn't see these other scholars coming to life and coming to the foreground. But that's we feel like that is a big contribution of the book, I think. And it's just, tip of the iceberg, really, isn't it? I wonder what other bits and pieces we could tell you about.
We could say a bit about the structure of the book, maybe. So as we said before, like the book is set between when they arrive at Oxford as young women in 1936 and 1956. And the reason we've chosen 1956 as the end date is partly because this is, in a way, the moment at which these four women emerge as fully fledged academics, if you like. And at that point, you can really see, they're beginning to publish some really important work. They're beginning to give really important lecture classes. And you can see at that moment already, sort of nascent in that work, the lines of development that they're going to pursue going forward. But the other reason is a kind of a narrative or dramatic reason, which is that in 1956, Oxford University decided to award an honorary degree to Harry S. Truman, the former president of the United States. And the way this worked is that the university kind of bigwigs would make the nomination, And then the nomination would be sort of waved through at the annual meeting of all the academics of the university. And Elizabeth Anscombe found out about this nomination and she was appalled. And she asked special dispensation from the university to be allowed to speak at the meeting where the degree was going to be waved through, if you like. And she turned up at this meeting, which would have been, you know, all the male dons, a little kind of smattering of women, but this, you know, great august, I mean, we've been to the place where she did this. It's a very intimidating, ancient room in Oxford University. And she stood up and she said, we shouldn't give Truman an honorary degree because he's a mass murderer and we shouldn't be honoring mass murderers. And that she said, I'm objecting to our honoring him because we come to share in the badness of what he did by flattering it, by praising it. And you can imagine this caused a right uproar. And the one of the male dons was kind of elected to respond, and he put forward the standard thought, which is that, look, the decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved more lives than were lost. So had that not happened, the war wouldn't have ended when it did. Many more people would have been killed, not just Americans, but Japanese. It would have, you know, the war could have gone on indefinitely. And actually one of the main male characters in our book was in a Japanese prisoner of war camp at the end of the war. And he says, you know, we would have died had it not been for that. So they put forward the kind of consequentialist argument that says, well, look at the consequences of what Truman did. And you'll see that it was the right action because the consequences of not doing it would have been much, much worse. And Elizabeth Anscombe says, when we're talking about murder, like, don't look at the consequences, look at the action itself. That's what really matters, morally speaking. Now, the way we structure the book is we begin with that scene of her giving that argument in 1956. Yeah. And then you go back to the beginning and you see Elizabeth Anscombe arriving as a student. And then the book ends, you return to that scene in Convocation. And like thinking about the way in which we kind of try to put the narrative and the philosophy together, the way we wanted to do that is basically to have it so that the scene at the beginning, which is also the end, sort of poses the philosophical question, you know, what should he have done? Like, was what he did the right thing to do? How should we think about what he did? And what does Elizabeth Anscombe mean when she says, you know, don't look at the consequences, look at the action itself? And when you encounter that scene at the beginning of the book, in a way, we wanted to make you as the reader as kind of confused and shocked by what she says as everybody else was on that day. And there's a kind of sense that everybody on the day was bewildered. Nobody could follow what she was saying. People thought she was, you know, naive and stupid, and she obviously didn't know the facts. But when you return then to the scene at the end, what we hope is that you have a philosophical picture from Anscombe and from these other women, that even if you don't agree with what Anscombe says, you can now see clearly the force of what she's saying and why she was saying it, and for her sort of what was at stake in that scene. So the hope is there that you pick up the philosophy as you go, so that when you get back to that, you can engage with it now philosophically and sort of make your own decisions. Does that sound?
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. You've expressed it really brilliantly, beautifully. But yeah, that's exactly it. We sort of pose a question at the beginning, ask the reader to ask themselves a question, and then hopefully you get a philosophical kind of education along the way, the education that the women got, such that when you come back to the same question, you can see what she's getting at. Yeah. So it's a kind of unusual form. It was described as logico-historical feminism. Logico-historical feminism. We were really happy with that.
Yeah, we said it was a new genre.
Yeah, it's a new genre. But yeah, it's a mixture of, I mean, there's lots of stories in the book as well. I mean, you can read it on lots of different levels. And I think some people have said that it's also quite funny. Yeah, which I have to say is Rachel's doing. But it is quite funny. So there's lightness and there's darkness, and
Yeah.
there's hard bits, but then there's funny bits, and
Yeah.
there's something there for everyone, we hope.
Yeah. So I think Claire's just put in a thing in the chat to say that we'll take questions in a minute. So
yeah, if you have in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so I was just going to say one other thing, which I think we kind of said, but it just made me think of it when you were just saying that at the end, that one of the things that we really didn't want to do in the book was adopt the kind of perspective of the kind of omniscient author, and particularly of the omniscient philosopher, who's kind of peering down at these women's lives and at the lives of everybody else, and saying, you know, and her philosophical argument was XYZ, and this has these weaknesses, and these are, you know, we didn't want to adopt that sort of perspective on the action, if you like. And instead we tried to stay, you know, along with this idea of animals, we tried to stay kind of on the ground with the women. And so we tried to make it so that you were, as a reader, and we as authors, were sort of situated in space and time where the women were. And we hope that that's given it a feeling of being a kind of adventure story, in the sense that it unfolds as you go along. And like them, you know, you don't know what's going to happen next, and, you know, who Iris Murdoch is going to end up marrying, and you know, whether Mary Ridgely is going to get the dream job that she wants, and, you know, how Philippa Foot and Iris Murdoch are going to mend their friendship, and all this, you know, because you're in there with them, sort of working out. And I think that was really important, again, for this kind of back to life thing, but also for kind of animating that idea of the sort of animality of us, in the sense that as animals, you know, we're at ground level, our feet are on the ground, and we've got a limited perspective on what's happening. And the only way we can, if you like, transcend our limited perspective is by getting together with other people and getting their perspective, and trying to collectively thread together some sort of broader picture of what's happening.
Yeah, and questions are the start of that.
Yeah.
You know, so
maybe Claire, if the other Claire is there, she might come and help us with the questions.
Absolutely. Let me just pull myself on screen to make sure everyone can see all of us. I've got a couple questions for you. Thank you so much. That's such an interesting conversation. So my first question is, you know, I know from doing a little research before the event, and it seems like from my research, it would seem that, you know, Elizabeth Anscombe was someone you'd done a lot of work with. Rachael and Clare, you've done work with Mary Midgley before. As you were writing this, did you sort of like change? Did a favorite emerge for you among the four? Did it change? Did like your opinion of these women change? Like, did anything shift for you, either of you, both of you, as you were writing? And maybe I have it wrong about, maybe the even question of favorites is incorrect. So please excuse me if that's not the right way to think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anscombe is the most well known within philosophy, I would say, and there's loads of anecdotes about her, you know, because she was like a cigarette smoking, trouser wearing, kind of foul mouthed female academic. So she broke like loads of boundaries, and she was pretty she didn't sort of suffer fools gladly. So there's been loads of anecdotes about her, and often they're, you know, about her domestic situation or her appearance, like the way she, you know, the way she presents herself. They're often quite sexist or misogynistic, I would say. So there's this sort of legacy of anecdotes to do with Anscombe that Rachael in particular you'd have been really familiar with. I mean, I'd heard some of them because I'm not an Anscombe scholar. I didn't really, you know, I knew of them, but I wasn't really sort of bound by them. My imagination, if you like, wasn't sort of bound by them. And I think like reading, you know, reading Iris Murdoch's journals and reading how she wrote about Anscombe, also just listening to Mary talk about Anscombe, like it was just another person that emerged, that like it just didn't really. And I think maybe because I didn't have that weight of anecdote, if you like, kind of clouding my imagination, I quickly saw a completely different sort of character, I feel like.
I think for all of them, the fact that we start with them at the age of 19 really helped to helped us to kind of see them in a really different way to how we would had when we'd engaged with them as philosophers, you know, on the page, because suddenly they were these 19-year-old girls, you know, arriving away from home for the very first time and trying to work out how to make friends. And, you know, and there's some lovely letters, especially between between Philippa Foot and Iris Murdoch, where they're writing to each other, and Iris is going, "Oh God, I'm such a terrible philosopher, I'm so stupid," and Philippa Foot's going, "No, you're amazing, I'm the stupid one," you know, and that kind of thing. It was so,
it really chimes and kind of quite recognizable.
But I think
they were quite identifiable just because they were young women, kind of also somewhat struggling in philosophy. Not so much again Elizabeth, but
I think Iris was the hardest, because Iris Murdoch, I mean, I don't know if you know her novels and if you've ever read any of the biographies of her. She's such a kind of life force, you know, she's this incredibly exuberant, productive giant of a person. Like, she's completely extraordinary. And because she was also an incredible journal writer, she wrote journals every day, and an amazing letter writer. We were sort of drowning in Iris Murdoch.
There's like 5,000 letters in her archive. And they're full of like all of her underlinings and there's like exclamation marks everywhere and drawings, and it's just completely, her on the page is just extraordinary to see, isn't it?
So trying to keep her in balance with the others, you know, and not let her kind of, you know, dominate the story. That was a lot of fun to kind of but to be honest, we love them all. I mean, somebody did say to us, you know, people might think that you're a bit too kind to everybody, but we just love them because, you know, of course they're flawed figures. I mean, they do some terrible things to each other, you know, in the way that women groups of friends do, or friends just do. You know, they're not saints at all. They fall out and they behave badly, but they're just real people, you know. And I think it was quite poignant, you know, especially because Mary died just at the beginning of when we started writing, to just treat them as, you know, as people trying to grow up and figure out what the hell to do in a world that was often, you know, hostile to the plans that they had and the, you know, the dreams that they had. So I don't think we have favorites, but
I mean, because we sort of hung out with Mary for 3 years, I suppose, before she died, we used to kind of go and, you know, maybe every week or every 2 weeks we'd go for tea. And so she became a collaborator, sort of friend, and a friend. And getting to know the young Mary was really lovely. I feel like we got a really good handle on her, how she was. Like just, even when we just write about her sort of having her sandwiches in, you know, sitting on a bench eating, it just feels like quite
fish paste sandwiches in bombed out churches.
But and also Philippa, I mean, they're very, very different characters. I mean, everyone is obviously different, but they're so different.
And actually, one of the things that's been really nice, because the book's been out for a few months now in the UK, is people will write. I mean, somebody even yesterday just said to me, "Oh, Mary's my favorite." And a few weeks ago, somebody had said, you know, "Oh, Elizabeth is incredible."
Someone said,
you know,
I'm in love with Elizabeth.
Somebody else says, "Oh, you know, Iris Murdoch is clearly the best." So I think because they've each got such different personalities, and that then inflects the way they take up these philosophical ideas. You know, it's like the Spice Girls, you know, there'll be one that you'll just be like, "Oh, that's the one that's got my, you know, that I would like to have known." So
and in terms of sort of psychology as well, I think that they have a different sort of temper. Like Iris is so dramatic and intense, so intense. Whereas Mary is much more pragmatic, but a little bit anxious as well. She doesn't have much patience for kind of too much neuroticism.
And Philippa Foot is so regal and discreet, pathologically discreet, Iris Murdoch,
and poised and just
but so kind.
Judicious.
Like she's really, she sort of is looking after them in a way that she often will sort of just see what Iris Murdoch needs at a particular point and just discreetly and carefully put it in her path. And then Elizabeth Anscombe is like nobody else. I mean, she is her own phenomenon.
Completely unconventional.
Yeah, so unconventional. Yeah.
Which it's such a I mean, it's such a lesson just to be confronted with that kind of lack of conventionality.
Yeah.
Like,
So yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer.
That was wonderful, and I'm going to carry with me the idea of these women as the Spice Girls. In the book.
I looked at me like, "What are you saying?"
No, I love that. But one of the things you said, talking about how in your answer you spoke a little bit about the sort of knowing them as people. That leads into an audience question here. I think it leads into it. I'm going to make it lead into it. So why do you think that these women grounded their philosophy and their work more in the practical everyday, as opposed to sort of the way their male colleagues were practicing philosophy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And whether it's, I mean, in a way, the answer might be by historical accident, because the kind of fashion of philosophy that was completely dominating in British philosophy at the time when they started was, inspired by Wittgenstein's Tractatus. It was very pure, refined, logical analysis, Bertrand Russell. So it was this very abstract, technical discipline. It had become that in those years. And we don't know what would have happened if the war hadn't come along. They would have been taught by those men, they would have been trained, in that method, and the men going, they got this other training as well. They got taught, they got taught Kant by refugee scholars. They worked with people from the Warburg Library. They were being taught by, old men.
I mean, some guys in their 80s that were in retirement had to sort of go and get their lecture notes.
Who were philosophers before, the kind of analytic tradition kind of marched through. Yeah. So it's partly, we think, because of the education that they got. It's partly, because they were we don't know. It's partly because we think, for Philippa Foot, she says that it was when they saw the pictures of the concentration camps, they just thought philosophy can't be the way that these other men say it is. It can't be this kind of abstract game of logic chopping that doesn't really connect to human life. It has to have the resources for us to be able to say, but you were wrong, this is wrong, this is evil, to use those sort of thick descriptive terms that we need to make use of to understand our life, rather than this kind of very flat, formal, descriptive apparatus that was kind of dominant for the men. So it's difficult to know how much of it came from their personality, how much of it came from the scene, how much of it came from the education. I think also, one of the things that Mary Midgley says is that the way that philosophy as a discipline evolves is that somebody introduces a paradigm, and then men get very good at technically operating within the paradigm, and the paradigm kind of the argument continues, people making these very small points in opposition to each other, and it becomes an inward-looking argument, and until somebody kind of comes along with a brand new paradigm, and then it all starts over again. And Mary says that, well, what happened when the war came and the men went away and we were in these little classes with conscientious objectors and refugees, is that we stopped arguing with each other, and we turned our attention onto, and she says, onto the deeply puzzling world. Like, the world called for attention at that moment. Like, it wasn't possible, I suppose, as Mary thought of it, to keep on at this game. And so instead of looking to each other to kind of try and fight it out within the paradigm, they all look at the world, and then philosophy changes its aspect.
Mary in particular does think, not so much the other women, but she does think that the fact that philosophy has been male dominated and shaped and practiced by men means that certain problems have arisen as philosophical problems, which wouldn't necessarily have arisen had philosophy been practiced also by women. So she gives the example of, you know, the mind-body problem is just not going to appear in the same way to a pregnant woman, for example. Like if a baby has colic because I've eaten something when I, you know, before I breastfed the baby, like the mind-body problem isn't going to show up in the same way to a pregnant or breastfeeding woman. Or like, how can two people be in the same place? You know, that's just not so puzzling from the perspective of a pregnant woman. So, I mean, those are not very good examples, but they're examples of the kind of lived reality of a human with a female body. And her thought is that, like, these people, this half of humanity, whatever, haven't really been doing philosophy. Had they been doing philosophy, then certain things that look problematic just wouldn't be problematic. So that's Mary's take on things as well. So she thinks there is a gendered aspect to not just how philosophy is practiced, but the kinds of problems that show up as problems for philosophy. Yeah, and she thinks it's quite solipsistic and individualistic and adolescent as well.
So we don't, I mean, one of the things, just going back to like not adopting this kind of omniscient author voice, we try to present all the facts as we found them. And the women don't all speak with one voice on this stuff. They all have different explanations, different ways of narrating what brought them to that point. And in a way, it's kind of open to the reader to weigh those different things and to think about how, you know, was it because they were women? Was it because of the war? Was it because of the education? Was it, you know, just that they coalesced on this thing, you know, just because they happen to? We don't impose an answer to that, but it's a great question. It's a great question. It's completely.
I don't know if it's interesting to any of you guys listening, but on our website, our project website, so the book is part of a wider project. So it's womeninparenthesis.co.uk. We have a Metaphysical Animals book club, which has loads of questions of this kind of just like that kind of question. Sort of, it has chapter by chapter sections with lots of questions, including like those kinds of questions that might be kind of interesting for people who would like to read the book together, because again, you know, friendship and kind of doing philosophy together is like something we've been trying to promote through the book, through our project, through our co-authorship, through our practice. And so, yeah, we wanted to create a kind of book club kind of context, or something that people could use to read the book together with others. So, you know, obviously if that was something that the Harvard bookstore were interested in, it'd be lovely.
Oh, that's wonderful. I just put the link in the chat so people can find it. And there's also a link in the chat to purchase the book if people want to do that. Another pitch in for that. So your answer to that question brought up a couple of other questions. So I'll see how many we can get through, but you talked about how Philippa Foot, seeing the becoming aware of the Holocaust sort of changed her sort of thinking about philosophy. Did any of your research into this time period with these four women change your perspective on World War II, or even carrying that forward? We're in a moment where there is war in Ukraine. Like, have you approached anything now in your thinking? Has that changed based on what you've written? And the experience of, you know, spending the time with these women?
I do have something to say. I'll say it quickly because you probably have something to say. I think for me, I mean, the war in Ukraine obviously is in our minds now, but the thing that's been in my mind for longer, I'm sure everybody's, is climate change. And I think that one of the things that I've always felt really uncomfortable with is, like, how am I going to justify being a philosopher in 30 years time, you know, when people, the next generation say, well, what were you doing, you know, writing philosophy books whilst the polar bears were going extinct? Like, this is not, you know, I've always had this fear in a way that philosophy is, you know, a kind of luxury good, if you like. And while now that there's an literally an emergency, it's not acceptable to be doing philosophy. And I think working with these women and seeing them doing philosophy, and one of the men in the book, R.M. Hare, he was coming up with his philosophy in a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Yeah.
You know, that coming up with philosophy, you know, refugee scholars who'd had to flee Nazi Germany with just one suitcase are writing books on Kant. You know, so this recognition that there's something about the need to keep thinking and creating and puzzling and studying, even in the, you know, when these terrible things are happening. And then also seeing, you know, for example, for Elizabeth Anscombe, when she made her protest, it was completely unsuccessful. Like, he was given the degree, everybody just thought she was a bit of an idiot, you know, it was forgotten. But now here we are 70 years later, and that action that she performed then, that piece of philosophy, is still unfolding in the world, you know, and it's still, you know, and the work that Iris Murdoch was doing just after the war is still generating ways of thinking about what's happening now that are productive in ways that she could never have imagined. So for me, it's kind of given me confidence again that there is something really important about doing philosophy. Not all I mean, some philosophy is terrible and it's clearly not important, but the even very abstract philosophy can be absolutely necessary even when we're living through terrible times that call for our attention.
I mean, I agree completely. I mean, I feel the same exactly. So like there's two aspects to it, like they're doing this conceptual work at, you know, in the face of just disaster, catastrophe, and at the same time there's this urge to do it, like it is a human need. And I completely agree. It has completely, I mean, we started off by saying, you know, we felt a bit at sea, or we felt a bit lost thinking about how we're going to make our way in philosophy. And I think like this has shown me and you, you know, that it is just a really essential thing. I think we're all metaphysical animals. All of us. You know, from to get sort of beaten out of us and we're children, you know, from childhood on, like we're just, it's an essential kind of orientation, I think. And I think that's what's so powerful about the picture of philosophy that you get from these women's lives and their work, and the, you know, the lessons for today and the spirit of the work, I suppose. But
that is such a hopeful answer. And perhaps like an excellent note to end on this Friday evening. We can all go back out feeling good about things. Which is maybe not the feeling we always get after philosophy talks. So.
Metaphysical Animals.
We got it. There was a really nice review or headline of the book today, and the headline was like, "Let's get metaphysical." So go and get metaphysical.
I love that. Thank you so much, Rachael and Clare, and for spending your night with us. And, you know, thank you to everyone out there in the virtual world for also spending your night with us. You can learn more about and purchase the book on harvard.com or via the link in the chat. And again, I also put the link to Women Apprentices in the chat as well, if you want to get even deeper in and with your own book club. And so on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and get metaphysical.
Bye, everyone. Bye.